Hi, I'm DeLeon, a digital media PhD student. This is my presentation on the gameplay and interaction design lessons learned from 219 daily prototypes. This is the format that I presented recently on January 31st at the GTRIC conference at Georgia Tech. Now I want to, for context, explain that this took place in 2007, started in 2007, ended in 2008, but so the Wii was new. Casual games in the downloadable market like Peggle were new, which was still then a $15, $20 product. The App Store, this notion of so many free and tiny and $1.99, $1.99 apps didn't exist for another year. The iPhone was out, the App Store hadn't started. Congregate, a now popular web forum for Flash games to be distributed, was only a year old and several years from GameStop's acquisition. Farmville, from Zynga, Facebook apps in general, Facebook games in general, had not taken off in the scene that they had. This is a very different market for games, independent, hobby, student scale, and otherwise. Even Braid, which of course was an important factor in independent games gaining sort of larger levels of recognition critically and financially, was at this point still a year away from its public release. Back in 2005, when I was an undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon, the experimental gameplay project took place at the Entertainment Technology Center, the ETC, graduate student section of Carnegie Mellon, and they had a process where every week one developer would be trying to finish a game, and they had about four of them sort of doing this in tandem originally, just a prototype to try to come up with new types of gameplay to see what would come out of the process, that they were trying to come up with things that you maybe couldn't invest a full team's efforts into doing until you'd first proven out the idea in a smaller format. But by the time, so that was been 2 years prior, by 2007, early 2007, Rod Humble discussed The Marriage at the Game Developers Conference, a game he built using very minimalist graphics, a downloadable PC game, in which you've got a male and female square, and their motions in relation to other dots represented how he felt the rules were between him, his wife, and other social interactions, and it created a new and different way for, at least popularized a way for game developers to discuss these sort of interactions and how they agree and disagree on what they represent to them and their own experiences to relate to. Later on in that year, Professor Ian Bogost at Georgia Tech wrote an article for Game Sutra titled Persuasive Games, Casual as in Sex, Not Casual as in Friday. As off-putting as the title might be, the notion is that games are becoming smaller and being played increasingly by sort of non-traditional game players, in the sense at least computer or video games were. And he was thinking about, okay, well maybe video games aren't going to be always this thing you expect to play hour after hour, day after day, sit down for 6-hour time spans. Maybe there will be a space for smaller, simpler games in which you kind of play it once and you forget about it, and you move on. And so we had some discussion, theoretically, of kind of what those kind of games might look like. This is also around the time when I had recently quit electronic arts. So for the 10 years prior to this, I had completed an average of 4 freeware games every year, though I had recently started full-time at Electronic Arts as a technical game designer, which involved basically signing paperwork, as most game developers will require you to do, that put major constraints on my ability to make games on the outside of the company, just due to conflict of interest concerns. Having recently quit, I was then freed from that pressure, and at an event, let's say around that weekend or less than a week afterwards, through my brother, I met some of his friends, and they said, "Oh, you make video games? Could you make us a video game?" And so I say, "Sure. What do you want?" What I'm really hoping, is that here are some people who aren't traditional game developers, who aren't game players even necessarily, and I was curious what kind of ideas they might picture in a video game and how what form those might take. And she said, "Okay, well, it's like Super Mario Brothers, but." So I was maybe a little disappointed in the response, but it had some interesting stuff. It had a wind level, had a ice level and fire level. But she did have this other idea of when you get a mushroom, instead of just getting bigger like Mario does, you should trip out like you're on mushrooms. And so I kind of had some fun with this and some screwy screen effects and giving the player higher jump capabilities and tying it in with kind of the movement in the game. But she said, "How long is it going to take to do this?" I said, "Give me, say, 3 days." And what was nice about this was that it allowed me to sort of produce this, effectively a joke in some sense, in a way that I would not have wanted to spend months doing, in the way my previous game development projects all did, or I would not have wanted to tied up a team of talented developers to do. But as one person working alone for a few days, this made sense. Now, additionally, for historical context, back in, again, this 2007, game jams in the way that we think of them now were very much in their infancy. There were a few of them we know now had started, but they were still very niche events, not in sort of the sense now of you expect you can make a game in 24 or 48 hours, so it's still kind of a weird thing to do it in 3 days as opposed to several months. Now, I had some driving beliefs going into this, and looking back in hindsight, I consider maybe these a little naive, a little simplistic, In my defense, this was 6-7 years ago. But more importantly, that these are the particular beliefs I held on to that produced this certain combination of crazy I needed to do what I was about to do. The first is that game development is largely an echo chamber by gamers making game-like things for gamers. Which is to say that there are ample games of spaceships blowing up spaceships and zombies being shot with double-barrel shotguns, and there wasn't a whole lot else going on besides further refinement of these genres that we figured out there was an audience for, war games and so on. And I was interested in what kind of games either non-gamers would want made if they had the ability to do so, or that non-gamers would play if they just existed, but there had been sort of a missing gap there from the fact that developers weren't making the kind of things they'd want. Point two is that developers should create original gameplay, or the ones who were creating original gameplay were burning years to polish, and I thought they ought to be doing R&D. Some of the people who were making really innovative games in the independent scene would come up with like one really creative, one really interesting idea that would then tie up 3 to 5 years of their life, during which time they were polishing. And that's the kind of thing that part of why companies exist, is it doesn't necessarily take sort of the innovative discoverer mentality or type to polish, to deliver on something once the foundation's been laid. I thought there should be some value in more people working on the question of just sort of more prototyping, more experimentation to figure out what else can be made. 3 is that whether a novel real-time interaction worked or cannot can't be known without implementing and trying it. So this is something I learned from Tomo Moriwaki, the lead designer on Boom Blocks during my brief time at Electronic Arts Los Angeles. But he had expressed this notion that like you can't tell in a real-time kind of game what's fun until you try it. And this makes sense when you think about it. But so there are games that are turn-based, that are based on tiles, that there's ways you can do statistics and probability and Excel spreadsheets to plan out and calculate certain types of interactions in those games in a way that for real-time interactive control you simply can't. And it's part of why we wind up with the echo chamber we do, is because out of the vast realm of possible mappings of motions to input controls, in fact only a small minority of those turn out to make sense to people, and so out of the ones experimented with at least. And so that's part of why that's going on, and so it seems like you got to build it, you got to try it, you can't just think your way through it. And that fourth is that the best way to improve design, and again this is my thinking at the time, was that if you were given 10 times the amount of design time, you should make 10 times the minis versions and keep whatever's the best from that yield. And that's something that, this is part of the idea of business books around the time were encouraging that, well, for a sufficiently creative workplace, you need to be creating a context where people feel safe making wrong ideas 9 out of 10 times, so that 1 out of 10 times that's great and innovative can come through. And so this is sort of an extension of that philosophy of, well, if you gave me 5 years, I would make 5 one-year games or whatever. And this is also a mentality that apparently I heard from folks Nintendo used to do, where they would finish many more games than they would actually release. And, of course, the top 20, top 40% of their work that they were near completion on inevitably kept a really high brand quality for them. I sort of looked at an asymptotic extreme of these by making an experimental gameplay or an experimental interaction project every day for 7 months, or 219 days, starting in 2007, ending in 2008. You can find all of these and play all of them at InteractionArtist.com. Now, I'll also say that 5 of these found their way into becoming iPhone and iPad applications I later developed, since the App Store started sometime after Interaction Artist. And these all did fairly well, but these were things which would not have happened without the Interaction Artist series, and to me are part of the yield from it. But why I'm preparing this presentation is because the other 214 projects have largely been forgotten, or some people have seen them but maybe not had a context for the patterns that emerged, at least from my viewpoint as a creator, and I wanted to share some of that. So one of the first largest patterns to emerge was simply, like I said from the beginning about that Boghost article, what do one-time play experiences look like? And so this is Power Swing, a game recommended or requested by Craig G. of Missouri. And he described this thing in which he wanted this very extreme swinging game. But I sort of just made this tension between the title screen, which plays some nice acoustic guitar, shows you this pleasant picture, and then once you start playing the game, then it goes crazy. It starts playing screamo music, there's snakes flying through the air, weird phrases pop up, the screen keeps shaking, you're a leprechaun, there's like a fire. And this is kind of it's a humorous moment for people the first time that they see it, and it's very much a one-time thing. Of course, after it's been spent on you, it's not worth doing it again. There's no way you're going to take months to develop a project to make a one-off joke like this, but if it's one person in an evening, there's no reason not to. And several of my games followed a similar pattern. So one of the complaints I got from the little bit of feedback I'd get on these while I was making them was that some of the games seemed too hard to folks. And so I made Candy as sort of my counter offering. And in Candy, you just click, and as soon as you click, it starts playing fanfare music, and the lights go crazy, and starts playing a little animation of how great you are. And that's something that, again, is this disassociation between the title screen expectation and what happens the moment you start the game. Killing Spree similarly establishes itself as a game in which you kill and eat everything. And then as soon as you start, it's a fishing game. I'm a vegan, and so sometimes I found its way into my work, but it's just this play, this one-off joke, and the fishing game kind of sort of works, but more importantly, the joke sort of works. Another category of these that worked for one-time games was games that are insight puzzles. Now, insight puzzles, unlike a lot of other types of, say, word search or puzzle games, are based on this thing of once you get the idea, you kind of got it for the rest of your life. It's sort of this challenge that's really hard to come up with, and once you figure it out, you're done with it. And so I made this game called Contract, or many people might misread it as Contract, in which there's a monster you're told to defeat, and the only way you can attack it doesn't respond to keys, doesn't respond to the mouse, but you can squish it by resizing the web browser, and when you squish your web browser far enough, it pops, and you've crushed the monster. This little insight thing, or insight problem. A similar insight problem in a game called Armistice Key. And again, game isn't always the right term to apply to these, but for this particular one, maybe. In this one, rather than using window sizing as the input, I use the system clock. So in Armistice Key, the wheels turn continuously, and what I'm hoping people make the connection to is that this is a representation of time. Armistice, if people Google, will find about Armistice Day and about the Armistice Treaty ending World War I on the 11th month, the 11th day, the 11th hour. And sure enough, if you set your system clock appropriately to 11 a.m. on the 11th day, the 11th month, then all of the walls will line up and you will complete the puzzle. Additionally, there's another category of games that worked especially well for one-off experiences. These are things which are a linear sequence of things to convey or deliver a message. Now, this isn't quite the same as storytelling, because it still can be interactive or sort of user-pushed, and so in the case of Lobster Claws, it takes over your mouse as part of trying to present a rhetorical point in a comparison to when lobster's claws are rubber-banded. In Empty, it presents an interface in which the user is just clicking between links, between email, MySpace, Facebook, blog, text messages, missed calls, and a to-do list. And it's this sort of loop that we find ourselves getting caught up in, and they start sending you messages from each other, and soon enough you get a sort of rhetorical point that I wanted to make about it. And it's not very complicated, it's not very, it doesn't have a lot of spectacle to it, but these are things which worked, I think, well for being something which was so simple to author, when the only work being done in the case of Empty was links and pop-ups. So lesson learned number one was that jokes, insight puzzles, and linear storytelling are devices that are particularly well suited to one-time use games. Another sort of inherent question I had to address was what can we make very, very quickly? In particular, my angle on it was I was trying to think about, is it possible to make something that takes actually less time to make than the amount of playtime you can get out of it? And a couple of easy, or common, I think, recurring patterns that solve this problem were, one, any sort of procedural generation of obstacle placement. And so this game on the left, you're driving a Jeep, and there are mines that keep appearing in random placement along the right. And these sort of resemble old games we used to play on graphing calculators, back in high school, for example. And this other game here, we see Comet Rider. The asteroids keep moving across the field, horizontally and vertically. You can aim and fire from whichever one you're on, and when you shoot another one, you teleport to it, and your only objective is to stay on the screen. There, rather than focusing on the procedural generation aspect, I focused on a difficult and novel input mechanic, which it turned out was sufficient to get more gameplay out of it than it actually took to make the game. One of the driving questions from the beginning, the same sort of thing that piqued my interest with Ginnyland, was what sort of things non-developers would ask for if prompted. Because when you're only one person, spending only one evening on a game, you can make things for people in a way that you're not feeling like you're getting caught up in, wasting resources if you were a team or on a bigger budget or schedule. And so I reached out and reached around. Unfortunately, I got some better answers, or I think more interesting answers maybe, than I got from the case of Ginnyland. And so on the top left here we see Dead Tattoo, in which the scenario presented me by Cersei in San Francisco was you find a dead body on the street and you are to tattoo it with a ballpoint pen. It's a little absurd, but it's the very simple thing to do. I took a photo of my pen, took a photo of my arm, built a basic line drawing application, and in the process, it sort of raises this question about how our conceptual canvas might affect the sort of things that we choose to draw. It certainly doesn't provide any sort of rigorous or scholarly answer to the question, but I do think it's an interesting and sort of memorable way to bring up the question altogether. And another example here, we have Ask Squirrel, in which someone said, I want to be able to talk to a squirrel. So I gave you a text field to type in any message you would like to a squirrel, and no matter what you say to it, it screeches back at you because it's a squirrel. And that was, of course, my also solution to the natural language difficulties of trying to interpret typed speech. Game on the bottom, we had a request for a game in which vision is used sort of against you, or your senses are used in a way that hurts you or harms you. And so in this case, you're controlling a cow that has to dodge fast-moving school buses, and the top part of the screen is dedicated to images that are intended to be distracting. Wild images, fine art, optical illusions, medical gore, things that your eyes are drawn to see, and it's trying to screw you up as you're trying to dodge these buses. This other game here, we just had a game celebrating the fact that a beagle won an important dog show, and beagles normally don't win dog shows, and so it was like, okay, what's it going to be like to be in the mind of a beagle? And so this is a simple experience in which you alternate between playing, sleeping, pooping, and eating. Seems to be pretty sufficient for a beagle's experience, and based on which mode the beagle wanted to currently be in, you'd have to move the mouse in different ways, in little wiggles, or just setting it still, or finding the right spot in the grass, for example. And this is something which is not necessarily outstanding gameplay, but in a weird way encapsulates this moment in a memorable way. Related to the question, or coming from the other angle, what people can ask for isn't always the same as what they actually want. Just because someone can articulate it doesn't mean anyone actually wants the output of it, and perhaps vice versa. So one of these sort of tangents that my later projects went onto were these things I called spacoids, for lack of a better name. It's a term which by design is meaningless, and when I first Googled it, didn't have returns or didn't have results. I didn't want something with any prior meaning assigned to it. Now this is something that conceptually is just a matter of having interactive particle systems. This one here, Firewriter, later turned to Burn It for iOS, is a game in which you can, or I say game, it's an interactive entertainment application in which you can draw with gunpowder and at your discretion light it to burn symbols, burn your name, spell things out, make wiggles and patterns. It's just kind of it's a toy with particles. This other one we see here is Tumult. This is actually the later Flash port of it, which is slightly more visually appealing. Originally it was just white dots on black background, but it's a weird vector field interaction with a mouse coordinate in a way that once you get some practice, you can sort of play it like an instrument. And what I found interesting about these were that there's several of my peers, an ex-Google employee, a game artist who's not necessarily that much of a dedicated game player, found these very satisfying in a way that they didn't necessarily find in the games that they played. And what interested me about these is that it's something that gamers, the few gamers I had getting input on these as I was developing them, didn't necessarily like these because part of their notion of what's a good game is that they expect there to be an objective, there to be a goal, there to be a clear purpose, maybe some narrative context, a character. And in these cases, I didn't adhere to any of those, which I think also helped welcome in people who normally would be turned off by those same features of what constitutes a game into making sort of an experience that's more suited to them. These were some of my more successful applications on iOS, and I think it's something which has since been found in many more applications within the entertainment app category on mobile devices. But again, part of the interesting thing about this is how much these were sort of only on the niche, or maybe didn't exist quite in the way they do now, only 6-7 years ago in 2007. I was also interested in exploring underused or weird control schemes. So the mouse is typically used as a form of direct manipulation, meaning that when you move the mouse left, the cursor goes left, and move it up, it goes up. In the game here we see this arm joint. It's called Robo Diffuser, and the mouse going left and right bends at the shoulder, the mouse going up and down bends at the elbow. And the challenge in playing this is to get that claw to grab these countdown bombs before the timer runs out. Simple concept, but it's something that ported later to iPhone as feel for it, using the accelerometers instead of mouse input, and it resulted in a very sort of novel mechanic landed at the game at IndieCade. On the right we see something here called TopogrTouch. Now TopogrTouch doesn't actually change the input device, but changes its representation by controlling the relative positioning and visualization of the cursor on the screen. I allow you to trace sort of three-dimensional graphs of two-dimensional planes, so we can or distortions. And so here we see Mount Everest's peaks mapped out in 3D. You can also do sort of random mathematical kind of functions and curves. And as you trace it with your mouse cursor, it moves as an offset as if it's tracing the surface. And so in this way you can sort of feel data representations in a way that otherwise you can't get out of a flat screen with a typical non-force feedback mouse or keyboard. The marriage being one of the inspirations for this project is something in which minimalist representations could afford interesting conceptual communication, or at least discussion. I started to ask myself, why aren't there more games like The Marriage? Why is it limited to showing the relationship between a man and his wife and their relationship to other social people, as opposed to maybe, I don't know, what it's like to have a dog, or what it's like to just be in the dating scene, what it's like, how you think about friendships. And what interested me about these is how different people might produce different representations of it. Again, this is part of discourse. Now, these are actually some of the more presentable ones that you're seeing here. Friends and abstract dating. Many of the ones that I worked on in this space wound up being just white dots moving or teleporting or dodging or appearing and disappearing in relation to one another in black space. And the challenge that I ran into is that it turns out if you try to rush this kind of game out in an evening as opposed to taking the time to really develop it, of course the difficulty is not in the asset creation of coming up with the representations of it, but probably in getting more feedback from people in terms of how they're interpreting it, making sure it's semi-consistent with what you're trying to get across. And instead I wound up sort of, anytime you rush speech, you risk offending some people, and so there are some people who would look at these and find them distasteful because they're like, well, is that who you think of me? And they realize it's a more delicate category than it maybe seemed like. Autobiographical games are a sort of thing that we didn't really have a lot of space for when games were predominantly $60 large-scale commercial projects. And when they're a smaller experience made by one person, like I say, and only in the evening and kind of throw away time, then it's a perfectly suitable outlet. And so doing dishes is a thing which has been a weird relationship in my life. I was never allowed to do dishes growing up. I kind of splurged on it in college, had an award named after me for my passion for doing it. And it's something which inspired me to create this dish-doing simulator in which you kind of have this slight sort of rhetoric about the proper way to use a sponge, where you got to use the edge of it to be effective in scrubbing off the stains. And it just counts down how many dishes you have left, and when you complete it, it gives you an offer to have more. We have this game up here in the corner. This is Bay Bridge, and it's something which is, it's just a reflection of this moment, this sort of like tiny vignette of my life. I was going out every day. I had worked overtime at a startup, came home, made an experimental gameplay project, and then I would go out and visit my friend across the Bay Bridge, lived quite a ways away, and by the time I drove back in the early morning, there were next to no cars on the street, and this was a very unusual sort of feel or visual. And I just wanted to share the kind of like that look of the lights as they dip and move past you as you steer left to right on the street, and there's not another car in sight. And this other one we have here is a story called Windy Day, and it's got some music, it's got some aesthetic. I sort of tried to explore the spectrum as far as what I could do asset-wise in only a day at a time. But in this case, I'm represented by a kite, and my home state of Missouri is represented as the character flying the kite. Inevitably, the kite escapes and blows away in the wind, and thanks Missouri for letting it go. I'll leave that interpretation up to the viewer. In looking for ways to communicate through game-like interaction, one of the ways that I found I could sort of manage more interpretational complexity or more conceptual sort of work than the usual graphical representation was to, instead of using characters or direct visual graphics, to instead simply put words in bubbles and allow the user to have some sort of interaction within the required quick reflexes. So the two shown here are good, not good, and is it vegan? Now in good, not good, it's trying to frame these different words in relation to my particular political and religious leanings, and it's something which is expandable to other types of mentalities. So in this case, words come up, and you're supposed to try to rapidly identify if it's good, click on it, according to me, and if it's not good, don't click on it. Again, from my point of view, and it's supposed to help highlight how some of your gut reactions to things are different, say, from mine. But the same sort of application can be developed from the point of view of someone with different political leanings from you, someone of different religion, someone of a different culture, and it might help you realize that you have some different associations than they do about positives and negatives. This other one we see here, is it vegan, just has to make you make rapid decisions about what foods are vegan and not. Of course, some people get trapped up on things like Jell-O, which is not. And it's just another way to try to show you that people sort of have to develop these new conditioning or these new perspectives on how they react to things when they have different points of view. One of the things I think is underutilized in the space of games for communication is games about games. Now maybe it seems obvious when it's pointed out, but games are a pretty good platform for making commentary about games. Here we've got Dark Place, which is an early example, one of the first Game-A-Days, or InteractionArtist projects that later became termed. And here I tried to distill down what are some of like the 5 or 10 basic things that make gameplay in a zombie game zombie-like. So even without the gore and the graphics and the cinematic visuals, how do things need to move? How do things need to work? What's the relationship between the data in the world and the player? And so I simulated a view frustrum, so the player can only look one direction at a time. I have the enemies sort of staggering inconsistently, so when you turn around you can't count reliably on the far away ones still being the furthest away. I've got enemies appearing as they get too close to you, because you hear them or they show up in the third-person camera, so to speak. And you've got a double-barrel shotgun that has asynchronous or sort of offsetting reload times that make it more difficult to hit your targets. I just want to make a minimal representation of like, here's what's going on in zombie games when they work. In the middle, we see here a game which is called Got Fleas, and you are rooting around in here with a mouse cursor, trying to find these little moving pixels to eat them. And it's a little gross. You're supposed to be eating lice out of hair, which is a thing I had heard that as late as the Civil War, apparently soldiers would sit around picking lice out of one another's hairs a bit like gorillas would, and eating them. But what I found interesting about this was, so the hairs subtly drift with the wind as you play, so it makes it very hard to see the dots moving around. You have to keep kind of rooting around. And when you're dealing with fleas, if you leave any fleas behind, then, of course, you'll get more fleas later. And so the only way to lose this game is to not find all the fleas and think you're done and click Declare Fleas Cleared. Otherwise, you have as much time as you need, and you wind up sort of compulsively rooting around in the hair because you're still not quite sure. I found this to be analogous, or hopefully, as gross as it is, less morbid or serious than the case of trying to excise, say, a cancerous tumor, in which case it's extremely important to get all of it, but the only way to really screw it up is if you think you get all of it, call yourself done, and you made a mistake of there's still some left behind, in which case it'll come right back. This other one here we have called Be Different, and that's just a representation of artificial intelligence with a slider for how random or deterministically aggressive it is. If you set them all to random, it's pretty easy to avoid the bees because you can just steer clear of the crowds, and they won't even find you if they pass right by you. If you go to the deterministic side, it's actually easier to trick them because you can simply run circles around them. Just the nature of how space is laid out, they will never get to you. But if you put it in the middle, it actually winds up being quite a bit harder to deal with because the ones who are more random wind up sort of spreading out throughout the field. The ones who are more deterministic keep you from being able to sit still and wind up pushing you into crowds of the ones that are more spread out. Which, as I've shown in another presentation I've got recently, is sort of part of the underlying mechanic of, say, how Pac-Man's ghosts are so effective. Now, games without score or progress is something which has since found its way into my work as something I call de-gamification. But it's an interest in what can you do in terms of gameplay that people don't play simply to get access to more features, or they don't play simply to get high scores, they don't play simply to get achievements or recognition, but instead they play because they like doing it, or there's something else compellingly creative, engaging about the core interaction. And there's various ways I tried to experiment with that question, one of which here, so we see Perilous Soar. It's a rather difficult game to play, but as the character moves throughout the world, it leaves a trail indicating a thickness of how much danger the player's character was in at that moment. So by the time you get defeated and finally hit one of these moving obstacles, you wind up with a fingerprint, a visual painting of your match depicting the stunts and the challenges that the way you played in a way that no one else would be able to craft the same image. This other one here, More, is one of the spacoids, and it's again something which, as you move the mouse around, you're interacting with a particle system, but it fades from sort of a solid kind of jello-like heart into more of a gaseous state into water as the mouse moves to and from in different directions, the center, and it's a way for sort of the player to play with this in a way that some people have responded very well to, but there's no score, there's no progress, there's no access restriction, there's no ammo limit. It's sort of de-gamified in an extreme sense of the word. One of the products of trying to churn these things out for 7 months on end is that you wind up sort of reusing a lot of your code. And so as soon as I had built a random maze generator that enforced proper mouse movement so you couldn't cut through walls, I milked that for all it's worth. I started looking at what are some different things I can do with this sort of starting point. And so I've got a game that mirrors and reverses your mouse input as you're trying to navigate the maze, which was actually a weirdly insightful game for a lot of players because suddenly you have to stop and think, okay, I want to go up, and on this level that means I move my mouse to the right. And it sounds easy, but it very quickly becomes frustrating on the levels that rotate and flip, so you can't just sort of rotate in your mind what's going on. And it helps put people who are otherwise very adept with a computer or controller interface in the same situation as a less skilled game player. And again, back in 2007, pre-smartphone games, this was kind of a lot of people who had the situation where they would want to play a game, but they would have to have this extra layer of consideration of they wouldn't just jump or shoot. They'd have to think, okay, I want to jump, and on this controller for this game, that's A button. And that extra layer of separation is part of what Mirror Maze helps put into the hands of otherwise people who are adept and comfortable with games. And then here on Warmer, I was just playing around with turning that same maze generator into a sort of traditional raycaster like Wolfenstein 3D or Catacombs 3D. And in that case, I was just trying to celebrate the enjoyment of rushing and running around in these spaces in the old way with lots of strafing and keyboard control. And so here, the maze's walls change color as you get near to the goal point, trying to run around until the walls get as bright red as possible, and it gives you a reason to be constantly moving to try to size up your position in relation to the goal you're reaching. Finally, and I was clearly kind of running out of steam here, these are games number 212 to 216, I sort of realized the emphasis and the importance of naming these little projects. Many times the name for me was simply an afterthought. I would make something interactive and I would think, what's a label for this? What's the thing I can put on here? Sometimes it was descriptive, sometimes it was arbitrary, sometimes it was playful, sometimes it was conceptual. And so here I took the same spacoid, the same interactive particle system, one that wasn't in particular special for any other reason, and released it under 5 different names: Respect, Sogny, Blue Yell Swirl, 56, and Banana. corresponding to sort of one that's, of course, loaded culturally as a term, one that's arbitrary and a made-up word, one that is strictly descriptive, one that's purely a number, and another that is a noun that has some vague connection to the color. But what I was wondering is if the label that we see, when that's such a large part of this tiny micro experience we have, how that might affect the expectations we bring into it for either how to interact with it, or how we intend to make sense out of what it is we're seeing and interpret it. Now I want to end on a call to action. This isn't really, the presentation was about the work that I did, but what I like to try to bring forth is this point that anyone can do this starting now. You can do this starting today. I had a friend who some years ago, inspired by this, started playing little songs on his guitar every day as a way to exercise and practice his skill at creating new music. Technology to do this is so much better already now, even just in 2014, than it was in 2007. You've got a ton of advantages I didn't. You're not trying to program this stuff and hacking together ActionScript 3. You've got tools at your disposal like Unity, which are far more powerful in terms of their ease of use. And you'll likely learn very different things than I did. It's hard to imagine that going through this you're going to run into the exact same lessons or examples that I found. It's a great way to get practice and momentum. And the way I like to frame this for people is to don't wait for a game jam to game jam. So even though game jams are now common, they come around once or a few times a year, they'll give you some sort of interesting theme. There's no reason why you have to wait for that event. There's no reason why you have to wait for someone else to give you a theme. Come up with your own theme. And maybe most importantly, don't stop after one. Just because you've made something in 2 days should be evidence to you that you could make something else in the next 2 days, and the next 2 days after that, or in fact, maybe one day, followed by another day. There's no reason to just do it once and then forget about it like you're somehow limited to that. I find this a very productive exercise to explore your thinking, to build by thinking and think by building, and it's something I hope to see more people participate in their own channels and styles in the future. So again, this is DeLeon for Hobby Game Dev. I want to thank you for tuning into this presentation, and I'll have some more content for you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.